fill a void here, but I think you're being very polite, Matt, when you say he was an enlightened realist. Mike is saying he was a hard realist. There's a whole bunch of things they did that do not fit into a hard realist view of the world. One, he sent 30,000 troops into Somalia.
I mean, to an enlightened or to a hard realist?
I think you're describing a liberal internationalist who's a realist or a pragmatist, who doesn't do things that are arrogant and that aren't going to work. But a hard realist does not believe in the United Nations. The United Nations is an irrelevant institution to a hard realist from an ideological standpoint. It's an annoyance. It doesn't have any power. It doesn't work. Now, a pragmatist says that the United Nations is weak, but it does work sometimes under some circumstances with American leadership. You could say that's a liberal internationalist position. But I think classifying him more as on the side of Kissinger and Nixon misses some essential things. Why did he send the troops into Somalia? Tell me what the national interest of the United States was in sending 30,000 troops into Somalia. Why did we invest a lot of time and effort in the developing world ending the Cold War there? That's not discussed in a lot of the literature. It was Hank Cohen, the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, who ended the Mozambican Civil War. He was deeply involved in that. He was trying to end the Angolan Civil War, not as successfully. But if you go through, there are areas that we don't have national interest in from a hard perspective, and yet we were engaged in. I would argue that the position that Jeff Engel argued in this meeting where on the first day of the aftermath of the invasion of Kuwait, that Dick Cheney's position was a hard realist position. He's selling the oil. All we really care about is whether the oil's on the market. Why are we going to interfere with his invasion of Kuwait? The liberal internationalist position was borders are sacred. You can't have people running around beating up small countries and invading them. That's a more liberal international position than a realist position, don't you think? This is much more murky than it would appear. And would you both comment on that? Because I think you're being polite to each other, but you're characterizing Brent Scowcroft in a way, particularly in the book, and you're writing, Mike, differently. You're not agreeing with each other, but you're being polite to each other on the panel.
Yo mama. I tried to preempt some of your fire by saying I wasn't arguing that Brent Scowcroft was a doctrinaire realist in the way that we disciples of Ken Waltz, believe every country ought to have a nuclear weapon and that there's no role whatsoever for altruism in world politics. And I certainly would not argue that Scowcroft, fits that caricature. But in terms of the general arc of his career, and I'm wrapping myself in the authority of my former classmate and good friend Matt Sparrow, whose book I did read, that in general, the basic persuasion that animated his approach to thinking about the big problems of the world was generally realist. Now, Bat points out that on some issues, particularly the latter stages of Vietnamization, Scowcroft was not as much with the realist angels as maybe we'd like. And I don't think to say that somebody's of a general persuasion that any deviation from that necessarily challenges that assumption. I'll say, I think you would admit I'm a pretty hardcore realist. And in general, I've been pretty consistent, although I wasn't on Libya. I thought that I saw in Libya a low-risk opportunity to take a nasty bugger out. And I was happy with how the the Obama administration and Secretary Clinton managed that. I learned my lesson. That was a debacle. And you may say that I'm not as good a strategist as I could be, but you wouldn't say that I'm not pretty generally a realist, particularly now that I've seen the light of the folly of liberal interventionism. And that's my only point with General Scowcroft. And you think of the opportunities he had to pursue that agenda and didn't. And the big thing that I think about is the debate in 1992. Nobody's talking about 92. Engel's book ends in 91, The World Transformed ends in 91. 92 is the lost year. Well, 92 was a big deal in the first Bush administration. It was the leaking of the 1992 Defense Policy Guidance, which was a blueprint for a very assertive neoconservative grand strategy, and one, at least to my way of thinking, that was repudiated by the White House. So it seems to me that there are plenty of things that one can point to that suggest a more consistently realist persuasion than not, Somalia notwithstanding.
The way I would answer that is that, the fact that they wanted, 12 UN resolutions for the first Gulf War, both, during the Desert Shield phase of it, speaks to their, to both Bush, and of course had been ambassador to the United Nations. Scowcroft actually earlier in his career had headed and led a chapter that was supportive of the United Nations. So he was supportive of the United Nations, also supportive of, about NAFTA, certainly about NATO for sure, and IMF, as I talked about. So he believed in international institutions, but I think the bottom line, and this is where I agree with my my rival here, is that he thought it was about U.S. leadership, and to have that leadership demanded material resources, and so this is where he emphasized prosperity instead of profits and trade, and also believed in U.S. hegemony, as the international relations would say, that the United States, when push comes to shove, would use those international agreements for the U.S. advantage or to further these global public goods, assuming that they were, goods for genuine public goods in the U.S. interest as well, but that he wouldn't sacrifice U.S. leadership, and he didn't want to sacrifice U.S. military strength. In fact, a crucial thing is after the Cold War, early on in 1992, people were calling for this drawdown of the military, and all sorts of criticisms and controversies there. And he doesn't want that. He says, no, we need to keep this. And so in that sense, I think he was really, at the bottom line, believed in American primacy, and that was really based. And he accepted the world as it was, with its dictators and tyrants, and he tried to sort of nudge things, move on the margins, and bring in other people. And if he thought, Somalia or other examples, and limited strikes in Bosnia Herzegovina, if there were occasions where the United States could do more for others, then fine. But generally, he was, I think, a believer in American sort of force and use being very judiciously and wisely, and for ultimately its own purposes.
Sir, I have a question for the realist, paradigm, and that is the issue of nation building. And I, some time ago, was watching a recording of Brzezinski's being interviewed, and he said that we had to go into Afghanistan after 9/11, but he felt we shouldn't have stayed there to try nation building, and that we should have gone in, taken out the Taliban, and then not try to stay and reform the whole society there, which we try to do, I think. And so, what is your concern about that? What is your reply?
I'm against it. Nation building, in my view, is well, first of all, I think when you look at the times in American history when we've committed ourselves to nation building, it's almost always been animated by this liberal belief that if we just, and I've just finished a chapter on Walt Rostow in Vietnam, and Rostow sort of epitomized the liberal consensus that all the world is basically differentiated only by where they are on the stages of his model of economic development. And every country wants to be the United States, and the only question is what we can do to help them move from the lower rungs on the ladder up to the top. Now, the problem is, of course, that all the world isn't like the United States, and it's not clear that all the world wants to be like the United States, which is what we discovered in Vietnam. And I think what we discovered also in different ways in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yugoslavia resistance.
I'm sorry?
Yugoslavia, in the breakup of Yugoslavia, and their hesitation to get.
Right, right. And so a conservative realist view would be humble about what American power could do, and would also be skeptical about meliorist programs that, you know, were sort of ultimately silver bullets. If only all the world were democratic and well-developed, all the problems in the rest of the world would become tractable. And it seems to me, when you talk about nation building and realism, the realist is going to say, don't do it.
Right. Thank you.
Just a kind of a question, but more a comment. I think it is impressive that you've been able to find a strand in Brent Scowcroft's thought, which looks realism in a sort of a constrained, maybe occasionally liberal tilting direction, and it obviously affects what he does, not just when he's National Security Advisor, but we can't obviously forget that his main service and his main role and the main revelation of who he was in this role, which is both a very important role and also a constrained role because of the working with and for a president. And that allows me to use a line that I should have used when I was on the thing in the morning. When we finished our book, we gave the manuscript to a colleague to review it, and he said, "I've learned one thing from your book for advice to national security advisors. Choose your president wisely."
Any comment on that?
No, but as I said earlier, I think there have been very few presidents who've had foreign policy advisors who've been that influential. I was thinking of maybe, as I said, thinking of certainly the Truman era and the FDR and maybe Eisenhower. And I think a lot of times it happens as it happens later on in their careers, especially if they're two-term presidents and they get to know the international world very much, and they come from a governorship or a senator from a inland state. No, I agree that relationship is critical, and I think if you're in a president like Obama who is not particularly attuned to foreign policy, and you come in and you have a National Security Advisor General James Jones, who you're not particularly close to, it's kind of a recipe for disaster, and so they stumbled around a lot.
I wonder if the legacy isn't the intellectual or ideological or doctrinal approaches that General Scowcroft took in office, and if the legacy isn't what was emphasized in the morning sessions, and that's the Scowcroft model of how to run a National Security Council. The honest broker, the effort not to be a major debater within the administration about policy. It does seem like there is now a consensus that that's the model that one should follow for building an effective national security team. And I wonder if you think that's not the biggest legacy that Scowcroft will have historically.
Actually, I'm going to use your comment, Greg, to respond to Mac, because I think you don't intend this, but one could interpret your remarks as going back to the Neil Sheehan view that that Scowcroft's genius was that he was the effective gray man behind the scenes, and I think there's plenty of evidence that at the organizational level he was quite effective, and there were some lessons to be learned there. But I think at the larger grand strategic level, he was part of a team that could think about the issues that they faced in a systematic, and a effective way. And so I think Mac's right. He chose the right president. And a lot of other smart people, including Bob Gates and Jim Baker, also chose the right president. And they were the right team at the right time. And it was more than just, the internal organizational stuff, but they also had a vision of the world and what the United States could and couldn't do in it that we were fortunate to have at this time, because we've seen the results of administrations taking a different approach that easily could have been taken at that time as well.
I had the National Security Advisor as my second point. The first one, you remember, was historically that this is really a absolutely crucial era in American diplomatic history, and the fact that this was the team then at the time made a huge difference, and the fact that Scowcroft's role on that team was critical to a number of developments. So that's kind of historically, he could have been, as we talked about earlier, he could have been Secretary of State, or he could have been in another role in the administration. I think he would have had a similar influence and maybe similar outcomes. But I think, again, the legacy is very early, and I think that's kind of the one that people already seized on, and that's, I think, a logical conclusion. But there are lots of other things there, I think, that goes about, okay, well, if it's a different era, different problems, well, what is it about him? Well, I think it's these organizational aspects, it's this human aspect, it's the ability to, the kind of enlightened realism he has, many of the things he has, I think, will come out and people will take different lessons from him. But I think certainly that's among the most important legacies, and right now it's probably the one that I think most of people associate is that Rothkopf has written on, and Mac and Evo and others.
I just want to dissent from one thing in your otherwise superb presentation, Pat. This continued use of the phrase enlightened realism, I think, is repetitive. Realism doesn't need that much fire.
All right, I think on that we should bring this session to a close. I want to thank both Bartholomew and Mike for their enlightening thoughts on the legacy of Brent Scowcroft. Back to you, Andrew.